Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient Egypt, but not the Egypt that usually appears first in the mind, all gold and curses and impossible stone blocks glowing under a museum light. Tonight we begin lower than that, closer to the ground, where the story is not polished yet. We begin with wet black mud under bare feet, with reeds moving in the dark, with a river that has withdrawn from the fields and left behind the strange gift of another year. The world we are entering is not only a world of pyramids. It is a world of ovens, ledgers, cattle, sandals, temple doors, fly-bitten afternoons, and men with reed pens trying to turn a flood into a number. It is a world where the dead required furniture, bread, prayers, linen, names, and better housing than the living. It is a world where a king could be called divine, but grain still had to be counted, beer brewed, and somebody still had to repair the canal bank. That is the first small crack in the modern fantasy. We tend to imagine ancient Egypt as a civilization of mysteries, as if its greatness floated down from the sky and arranged itself into perfect triangles. But Egypt's miracle was not that it escaped ordinary life. Egypt's miracle was that it organized ordinary life so intensely that ordinary life began to look eternal. The civilization did not rise because people were free from mud, hunger, heat, paperwork, labor, illness, ambition, and fear. It rose because all of those things were pressed into a system that could survive longer than most kingdoms. So if you enjoy this kind of slow, strange history, tap the like button, subscribe for more long journeys like this, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. There is something appropriate about people in different rooms, listening at different hours, to a story about a civilization that spent thousands of years measuring time by water, stars, kings, harvests, and the sleep of the dead. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture the Nile before it becomes a monument in anyone's mind. Not the postcard river with cruise boats and sunset photographs, but the ancient river as a yearly force, moving through northeastern Africa with a patience that feels almost impolite. It does not hurry. It comes, rises, spreads, retreats, and leaves everyone to organize life around what it has done. For ancient Egyptians, this was not scenery. It was the calendar, the pantry, the tax office, the road, the border, the god-haunted spine of the country. Egypt was famously described by the Greek historian Herodotus as the gift of the Nile, and like many famous lines, it is both useful and a little too neat. The river did not simply hand Egypt to civilization, it created a possibility. Human beings did the exhausting part. After the inundation, the floodwater left dark, fertile silt on the land, the black earth that helped distinguish the living fields from the surrounding red desert. In broad terms, this annual cycle supported agriculture, especially grain cultivation, and agriculture supported population, storage, taxation, temples, armies, royal projects, and the administrative fuss humans create when food becomes predictable enough to argue over. A river can be a mother and a manager and a threat, sometimes in the same year. This is where Egypt begins to become itself, not at the top of a pyramid, but at the edge of a field. Imagine a farmer watching the water withdraw. The mud is rich, but it is not yet bred. It has to be worked. Boundaries have to be remembered or remeasured. Channels have to be cleared. Tools have to be lifted again. Seeds have to go into the ground at the right time. The body learns the civilization before the mind names it. The feet know the mud. The shoulders know the load. And somewhere nearby, or perhaps later at an administrative centre, someone records what can be owed. That is one of the quiet turning points in human history. When the flood becomes a field, the field becomes grain, grain becomes tax, tax becomes temple bread, worker rations, royal wealth, military supplies, and tomb offerings. The river becomes a ledger. It is still water, still mud, still fish and reeds and crocodile danger, but now it is also columns of expectation. How much land? How much yield? How much labour? How much belongs upward? There is a dark comedy hidden here, the kind history specialises in. One of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world may begin, emotionally speaking, with the sentence, "Someone has to keep track of this." Not very glamorous, no golden mask, no curse on the wall, just the ancient human discovery that if food can be counted, somebody important will eventually appear to count it. That does not make Egypt small. It makes it more astonishing. Because the grandeur we remember was not separate from the counting. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom, the temples of the New Kingdom, the painted tombs, the carved names, the offerings to gods and the dead, all depended on the same transformation. Nature produced abundance unevenly. The state tried to make that abundance legible. Religion gave the work cosmic meaning. Labour gave it muscle. Writing gave it memory. Ancient Egypt lasted for so long that speaking of it as one thing is dangerous. Modern scholars divide its long history into periods, such as the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. But those are our study labels, not how most Egyptians would have spoken about their own lives. They lived under particular kings, local officials, family obligations, festivals, floods, debts, hopes, and griefs. Still, the broad pattern matters. By the Old Kingdom, Egypt had developed centralized power, capable of building monuments that still make modern visitors go quiet. By the Middle Kingdom, after reunification, Egyptian culture flowered again. By the New Kingdom, Egypt projected military and diplomatic power far beyond the Nile Valley. But beneath these large movements, the same pressure keeps returning. Order must be made again and again. Order is not a possession, it is a chore. The Egyptians had a word at the heart of this idea, ma'at. It is often translated as truth, order, balance, justice, or cosmic rightness, and no single English word catches all of it. Ma'at was the principle that the world could remain livable if gods, kings, officials, priests, farmers, scribes, and households performed their roles correctly. The sun rose because cosmic order held. The Nile returned because order held. Offerings were made because order had to be fed. To a modern ear, this may sound like theology, and it was. But it was also politics, agriculture, labour management, and emotional survival. If chaos was always waiting outside the cultivated land, then keeping order was not a decorative idea. It explained why the field mattered, why the temple mattered, why the king mattered, why the scribe's ink mattered, and why your own tired body had to rise again tomorrow. That is why the true story of Egypt cannot begin with a mummy's face behind glass. It has to begin with the repeated human act of making the world stable enough to trust. A field measured after flood. A basket of grain sealed for storage. A name written so it would not vanish. A body wrapped so it could cross into another life. A king carved in stone so his rule would look less temporary than flesh. The first great monument, then, is not stone. It is the decision to believe that the world can be put back in order after the waters move. The body learns the lesson before anyone explains it. Stand in that early field long enough, and Egypt stops looking like a collection of marvels and starts looking like a bargain struck with water. Not a gentle bargain. The Nile is generous, but it is not sentimental. It gives in its own season. It takes up space without asking. It leaves fertility behind, but not convenience. The mud is thick, the insects are awake, the sun is already becoming a second ruler, and the farmer's reward for surviving 1 year is the privilege of beginning another. This is where the old division of Egypt becomes more than a phrase from a museum label. There was Kemet, the black land, the fertile strip where the flood had been, and there was Deshret, the red land, the desert beyond, dry and bright and dangerous in a way that must have felt almost honest. The black land fed you, but demanded work. The red land threatened you, but also preserved the dead. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the land of life was wet enough to decay things, while the land of danger became perfect for keeping tombs. So the Egyptian world was built around contrast, wet and dry, field and desert, life and burial, riverbank and cliff, crowded village and silent cemetery. The contrast was not abstract. You could see it by turning your head. On one side, green growth and people shouting over animals. On the other, stone, glare, and the kind of emptiness that makes a person believe in borders. A modern map makes Egypt look wide. Ancient life often made it feel narrow. Much of the inhabited world clung close to the Nile, stretched long and thin along a ribbon of survivable land. That geography mattered. It made movement possible along the river. It made communication easier than in many regions broken by forests, mountains, or scattered rainfall. It also made central control imaginable. If life gathers along one great line, officials eventually learn to travel that line, tax that line, command that line, and claim that line in the name of order. But before command, there is bread. Before kings become eternal, someone has to make dough. The ordinary Egyptian diet varied by class and period, but bread and beer sat close to the centre of daily nourishment. This does not mean everyone was pleasantly sipping tavern beer beside fresh loaves, like history had invented a rustic brunch. Bread could be gritty from stone-ground flour. Beer was often nourishing and lower in alcohol than the word may suggest to modern ears. Together they were food, pay, comfort, ritual substance, and proof that the field had become something the body could use. The road from flood to bread was full of labour. Grain had to be sown, watched, harvested, threshed, winnowed, stored, ground, mixed, baked, moved, counted, and redistributed. Each step had hands in it. Each step had loss in it. Birds, rodents, rot, bad storage, bad flood, bad official, bad luck. The civilization's grandeur rested on this fragile chain. A pyramid may look eternal, but the people who made pyramid building possible still needed lunch. That is why agriculture in Egypt was never just agriculture. It was the base layer of politics. A harvest was not only a harvest, it was the state's opportunity to become real. A king too far away to be seen could still arrive as a demand on grain. A temple god too sacred to touch could still eat through offerings brought by human hands. An official could stand at the edge of a field and make power visible with a measuring cord, a seal, a tally, or the simple talent of writing down what another person owed. Writing has a strange presence here. It is beautiful when carved on temple walls, but in daily administration it had a colder magic. It could make a spoken agreement survive the afternoon. It could make a tax demand travel. It could turn a household's work into a mark that someone else could inspect. To be a scribe was not merely to have nice handwriting. It was to enter the machinery of memory. The scribe did not need to swing a hoe to change the farmer's life. Ink could be lighter than a tool and heavier than a stone. This is one reason scribes held such a powerful place in the Egyptian imagination. Literacy was limited, and writing carried prestige, practicality, and authority. A written record could outlast the voice that complained about it. There is a dark little joke in that. Many ancient people worked until their backs hurt, while the person who wrote down the work got better odds of being remembered. History, as usual, has a weakness for the people near the ink. Still, the scribe was not outside the system. He was inside it, trained by it, useful to it, and sometimes trapped by it. Administration was not modern in the sense of office lighting and passive-aggressive emails, but it had the same ancient soul. People with authority asking where the goods are, why the numbers are wrong, who failed to deliver, and whether someone can please explain the missing barley before this becomes unpleasant. The Nile made abundance possible. Administration made abundance collectible. Religion made collection meaningful. And habit made the whole thing feel natural. A farmer might not think in those terms. He might think of seed, tools, animals, family, sore knees, and whether the official estimate was fair. His wife, depending on period and status, might be managing food, textiles, children, household property, brewing, baking, exchange, and the 100 forms of labour that disappear precisely because everyone depends on them. A child might learn the river first as smell and noise, damp mud, animals, oven smoke, adult voices, the slap of water against a bank. Civilization enters children not as ideology, but as chores. And all around them, the larger order presses in softly. Festivals interrupt the work year, temples receive offerings, local elites display status, boats move goods along the river. The dead remain nearby, not as horror, but as obligation and memory. A family does not need to own a pyramid to care about the afterlife. Eternity, in Egypt, was not only royal architecture, it was a cultural pressure. The dead had needs, the living had duties. Names mattered, offerings mattered. Correct action mattered. The genius of Egypt was that it tied these layers together. The river's rhythm became the agricultural rhythm. The agricultural rhythm became the tax rhythm. The tax rhythm fed the temples and the court. The temples and court justified the order that collected the tax. The afterlife gave ordinary actions cosmic weight. Bread was never only bread for very long. And this is where the familiar golden image begins to change. Egypt's greatness was not a glittering surface placed over a simple world. It was a dense arrangement of repeated acts. Measure the field, cut the grain, grind the flour, bake the bread, brew the beer, mark the tally, feed the god, feed the worker, name the dead, praise the king, repair the bank, begin again. The pyramid is only the loudest sentence. The civilization itself is the grammar underneath. What follows is not a miracle in the way later imaginations prefer miracles. It is quieter and stranger than that. A miracle usually lets people skip the work. Egypt's miracle made the work sacred. This is where kingship enters the story, not as a golden crown floating above the fields, but as an answer to a practical terror. The river might rise too little, it might rise too much. A boundary stone might vanish under silt. A local official might take more than he should. A canal might fail. A harvest might disappoint. A neighbour might dispute a line of land after the flood has politely erased the evidence. If the world had to be remade every year, someone had to claim responsibility for the remaking. The pharaoh stood at the top of that claim. To modern ears, pharaoh can sound almost like a costume. Striped headdress, false beard, profile pose, 1 foot forward forever. But kingship in ancient Egypt was not only decoration. The Egyptian king was understood as the central human figure in the maintenance of order, and the office of kingship was deeply tied to ma'at, that difficult word that means truth, order, justice, balance, right arrangement, and the world behaving as it should. The king's duty was not merely to rule people. It was to help keep existence from slipping back toward chaos. That sounds enormous because it was enormous. It also sounds convenient because it was convenient. Divine kingship is one of history's most impressive ways of saying, please pay your taxes, the universe depends on it. The joke is unfair, but only partly. Egyptian kingship really did carry religious meaning. The king was associated with gods, stood between the divine world and human society, and performed or authorized rituals that kept the gods properly honored. But the same belief also supported administration, hierarchy, and obedience. If the king maintains cosmic order, then the king's granaries are not just storage facilities. The king's commands are not just commands. The king's building projects are not just architecture. They become part of the maintenance of reality. This is how power becomes more than force. Force can make a person carry stone. Meaning can make the stone feel like part of the universe. That does not mean every worker woke each morning glowing with theological enthusiasm. Human beings are rarely that tidy. Some people believed deeply. Some obeyed because everyone around them obeyed. Some worked because they owed labour. Some worked because Russians were attached. Some worked because officials had lists, and lists are ancient magic with bad moods. The point is not that every person felt the same thing. The point is that the system gave labour a story big enough to contain exhaustion. By the Old Kingdom, this fusion of kingship, administration, religion, and labour had become capable of producing the most famous monuments in Egypt, the pyramids. And here we have to step carefully, because modern myth loves to stand at the base of a pyramid and shout nonsense into the desert. The pyramids were not built by aliens. They were not built by a lost super-civilization with vanished machines. And the older popular image of huge gangs of enslaved people whipped across the sand is too simple for the evidence we now have. especially at Giza. Archaeology has revealed worker settlements, bakeries, cattle bones, barracks-like housing, administrative evidence, and signs of organized provisioning. The labor system was complex, involving skilled workers and large-scale mobilized labor, likely including forms of state obligation. That is not the same thing as modern freedom. It is also not the cartoon of endless anonymous slaves collapsing in neat rows for a movie camera. The truth is more interesting because it is more human. Imagine not one endless chain of misery, but a whole support system. Quarrymen, haulers, boatmen, bakers, brewers, toolmakers, overseers, scribes, cooks, physicians or healers, and workers whose names sometimes appear in graffiti-like crew marks. Some teams seem to have had identities, even pride. People can be proud and exploited at the same time. History is impolite that way. It refuses to keep its moral categories clean for us. The pyramid becomes less mysterious when you see the logistics, and more astonishing when you see the logistics. The mystery is not, how could anyone move a stone? People are clever, organized, stubborn, and very good at making the next person help. The deeper question is, what kind of society can feed, direct, motivate, record, and justify such work over years? What kind of world makes a royal tomb into a national project? What kind of belief turns a dead king's afterlife into a living person's work schedule? Here, the river ledger returns. Without agricultural surplus, there is no pyramid age at that scale. Without stored grain, workers cannot be fed away from their own fields for long periods. Without scribes, deliveries become rumours. Without officials, crews scatter. Without ideology, the entire thing looks dangerously like one family's stone mountain. With ideology, it becomes a cosmic machine, the king's eternal life, the stability of the land, the favour of the gods, the continuation of order. And because the Egyptian king was not just a manager, but a sacred office, royal death did not end royal importance. Death intensified it. A dead king could become more permanent than a living one, precisely because stone does not catch fever, age badly, or lose arguments at court. The pyramid was a tomb, but also a statement that the centre had held. It told anyone who could see it that the kingdom had enough food, enough authority, enough belief, enough mathematics, enough skilled labour, and enough confidence to lift the desert into geometry. That confidence was not constant. Ancient Egypt had periods of fracture, decentralization, foreign rule, recovery, expansion, and decline. The Old Kingdom itself eventually gave way to instability. No civilization simply lasts because it has good symbols. Symbols need food. Bureaucracies need trust or fear. Kings need cooperation. Floods need to arrive. Local elites need to be managed. The centre must keep persuading the edges that the centre is worth obeying. But when it worked with extraordinary elegance. The king sat at the visible summit, while beneath him ran layers of officials, scribes, priests, estate managers, craftsmen, farmers, labourers, and households. The whole society was not a neat pyramid, whatever school diagrams suggest, because real life is always messier than triangles. But the metaphor survives because Egyptian order itself loved hierarchy. The gods above, the king below the gods, the officials below the king, the workers under officials, the dead requiring service from the living depending on the flood, and the flood folded into divine order. A person standing near the bottom might not see the whole structure. They might see the immediate face of power, a foreman, a tax collector, a priest, a local notable, a scribe with dry hands and an irritatingly permanent record. But the pressure came from above and beyond that person. It came dressed as duty, ritual, season, tradition, and necessity. That is how the first great system layer settled over Egypt. The river fed the land fed the state fed the gods justified the king promised order, and ordinary people, with their bread, beer, sweat, arguments, skill, fatigue, and belief, kept the promise from becoming only words. The crown was high, but its shadow reached all the way down to the mud. The shadow did not feel like an idea when it reached a house. It arrived as a ration, a demand, a festival day, a missing son called away for labour, a measure of grain that seemed smaller than last year, or a seal pressed into clay by someone who did not have to grind flour before sunrise. Power in Egypt may have worn crowns and spoken to gods, but it entered ordinary life through very ordinary openings: the door, the storage jar, the field path, the oven, the body. An Egyptian house was not a palace with the gold removed. For most people, it was a practical shelter made from mud brick, that ancient material with no interest in glamour and every interest in usefulness. Mud brick had the honesty of the riverbank. It came from the same world that fed the fields: earth, water, straw, sun. Shaped, dried, stacked, repaired, it made walls that could keep out some heat, some wind, some animals, some eyes. Not all. A house in a village is a compromise with dust. Inside, daily life would have been crowded with things that rarely survive in royal imagination: baskets, mats, grinding stones, storage jars, stools, tools, scraps of linen, sleeping places, children, insects, smoke, and the steady irritation of chores that do not become famous simply because everyone would die if they stopped happening. A civilization can carve a king into stone and still depend on someone remembering to patch the roof. The roof itself mattered. Flat roofs could become workspaces, sleeping spaces, or places to catch air when the rooms below held heat too stubbornly. Heat in Egypt was not just weather. It shaped the hours of labour, the feel of clothing, the pace of walking, the value of shade, the smell of crowded spaces, and the simple pleasure of evening. The body understood architecture by temperature. A doorway was not merely an entrance, it was where light, air, neighbours, animals, and gossip negotiated with the household. The household was one of the quiet engines of Egypt, and like most quiet engines, it has often been made smaller in memory than it was in life. The monuments tempt us to look upward, toward kings and gods, but the civilization had to be reproduced each day in rooms where bread was baked, beer was brewed, textiles were worked, children were fed, relatives were argued with, and property was managed. The administrative state could count grain, but it did not chew for people. It did not nurse infants. It did not carry water into every courtyard. It did not soothe every fever. Women's roles varied by class, period, and family situation, and we should not flatten 3,000 years into a single confident sentence. But compared with many other ancient societies, Egyptian women could, in many contexts, own property, make contracts, inherit, divorce, and appear in legal records. That does not mean life was equal in a modern sense, or easy, or free from social pressure. It means the legal and household picture is more complicated than the old habit of imagining ancient women only as silent background figures. In Egypt, a woman might be represented through ideals of wifehood and motherhood, but she could also appear as an economic actor, a property holder, a litigant, a worker, a priestess, a singer, a brewer, a weaver, a manager of household survival. And survival had many textures. The day might begin before the heat became punishing. Bread required grinding grain, and grinding is one of those ancient tasks that sounds simple until you imagine doing it every day. Stone against grain, body leaning into the motion, dust rising, fine particles in the air. The result could be nourishing, but also gritty, because stone tools left traces. Teeth from ancient Egyptian remains often show heavy wear, and while diet varied, the physical reality of eating bread made with stone-ground flour was not gentle. Even the daily staple carried the memory of the tool that made it. Beer, too, belonged to the ordinary rhythm. It was not merely a luxury or a sign of bad decisions at a late-night tavern of the imagination. It was part of diet, wages, offerings, and social life. Bread and beer sat together in a way that makes the ancient kitchen feel less distant. Grain became paste, loaf, mash, drink, ration, gift, prayer. The same base substance moved through the body, the economy, and the temple. In Egypt, even breakfast could have a theology problem. The smell of a settlement would have been layered: smoke from ovens, animals, human bodies, damp river mud, dry dust, beer fermentation, fish, sweat, linen, dung fuel in some contexts, flowers and oils where wealth allowed. The ancient world was not one smell, it was a moving argument between smells. Wealth could soften the argument. Perfumed oils, cleaner linen, better space, more servants, more access to shade and storage could make life less abrasive. But no one lived outside the body. Even the elite had skin, teeth, digestion, illness and death waiting patiently beneath the jewelry. Class changed everything. It changed what you ate, how much you worked with your hands, how much privacy you had, how your body aged, how close you lived to animals, what kind of tomb you might hope for, and whether officials were people you became or people you feared. A high official could imagine eternity with painted walls and careful inscriptions. A farmer might imagine it with smaller offerings, family memory, and whatever means were available. The afterlife was a shared cultural horizon. But the road toward it was paved very differently depending on wealth. This difference matters because elite tomb scenes can be seductive. They show agriculture, feasts, hunting, music, servants, offerings, orderly rows of labourers, fat cattle, perfect boats, and beautifully composed abundance. They are precious evidence, but they are also staged worlds. They show what elites wanted preserved, not necessarily what everyone felt at noon when the air was hot and the work was still unfinished. Tomb art can tell us about tools, values, ideals, labour divisions, and elite imagination. It cannot be treated as a candid photograph of ordinary life. The ordinary world was more uneven, more improvised, more tired, and probably much louder. Children ran through it, dogs barked, donkeys complained as donkeys have always understood the emotional burden of civilization. Someone spilled something. Someone burned bread. Someone argued about a debt. Someone tried to sleep while a neighbour's household performed the ancient community service of being audible. Villages and towns were not silent tableaux. They were social machines, full of watching, helping, judging, borrowing, lending, gossiping, and remembering who failed to return a tool. And yet this ordinary noise is precisely what makes Egypt great. Not less great, more great. Because the civilization did not exist only when a pyramid was finished or a temple wall was carved. It existed when someone swept a floor, when a child learned a task, when a woman measured out grain, when a man repaired a tool, when a family carried offerings, when neighbours shared labour, when an old name was spoken again so the dead would not vanish entirely. The state claimed eternity in stone, but daily life practiced a smaller eternity. Do the necessary thing again. That is the quiet discipline beneath the monuments. The whole society depended on repetition: flood, field, grain, bread, beer, work, record, ritual, burial, memory. Again and again, across dynasties, through prosperity and strain, through centralized power and political fracture, through local habits and royal dreams. The system was not held together only by command. It was held together by the repeated bodily knowledge of how to keep going. And in the evening, when the heat loosened and the river darkened, Egypt must have felt less like a museum and more like what it truly was. People breathing beside water, inside walls made of dried mud, under a sky full of gods, wondering what tomorrow would demand. Where a person stood mattered, because Egypt was never only a landscape, it was a ranking system, with a river running through it. Rank did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sat in a chair while others stood. Sometimes it lived in the softness of linen, the size of a storeroom, the number of people who could be summoned by name, or the difference between writing a command and carrying it out. The ancient world loved visible hierarchy, but it also loved small humiliations, the kind that do not become inscriptions. Who waited outside the doorway? Who entered the shaded room? Who spoke first? Who could afford to lose an afternoon? At the top, the king occupied a space so high that ordinary comparison almost breaks. The king was not merely the richest man with the best hat, although the hats were certainly doing their part. He was the living centre of the state's sacred imagination, the person through whom order was affirmed, temples were endowed, enemies were ritually defeated, and the gods received the proper attention. But no king ruled alone, and no king could personally inspect every field, temple estate, granary, work gang, and dispute over a donkey. Power needed helpers. Egypt had many. Officials, governors, estate managers, priests, overseers, scribes, military men, and local elites formed the working skeleton of authority. Some were close to the palace, some were anchored in provinces, some served temples, some served royal estates, some served households powerful enough to behave like small governments. A person lower down might never see the king, but he might see the local official who represented the king's appetite. That was enough. Power does not need to arrive in person when it has deputies. The scribe sits in the middle of this world like a small, dry-handed miracle. He is not necessarily the most important person in the room, but he can make other people nervous. He knows the signs. He can copy, record, calculate, list, and report. In a society where writing is limited, literacy is not just skill, it is a gate. Those who pass through it can enter offices, temple administration, royal service, legal culture, and the safer side of command. Those who do not may still be essential, but their labour is more likely to be counted by someone else. There is an old Egyptian text, often called the Satire of the Trades, in which the scribal life is praised by comparing it favourably to other occupations. Like many teaching texts, it tells us as much about aspiration and ideology as it does about reality. It makes hard manual jobs sound miserable, which, to be fair, was not an impossible argument. But it also reveals something sharp. Education could be sold as bodily escape. Learn the signs, and maybe your back will not belong to the field. Learn the signs, and perhaps you will command the person carrying the basket. Below the scribes and officials, the world widens. Farmers, labourers, herders, fishermen, craft workers, potters, builders, quarrymen, boatmen, brewers, bakers, weavers, servants, dependents, and enslaved people all appear in different ways across Egypt's long history. The categories were not always identical to modern categories, and evidence changes by period. Some people owed labour to the state, some worked on estates, some were attached to temples, some were captives from war, some were household servants, some were skilled specialists whose work brought respect but not equality. It is tempting to arrange everyone into a neat pyramid and be done with it. Egypt itself would probably appreciate the shape. But real social life was more tangled. A skilled artisan in a royal tomb village might have more stability, status, or pride than a poor farmer in a difficult year. A woman with property might have more legal leverage than a man without resources. A priestly office could bring influence, but also obligation. Status was a ladder, but also a set of rooms, doors, kinships, titles, tools, and grain jars. Law, too, moved through this world less like a modern codebook and more like a practice of order. Egyptian legal records show disputes over property, inheritance, contracts, marriage arrangements, theft, labour, and family matters. People could petition, they could testify, they could complain, they could produce documents. The fact that ordinary disputes reached records does not mean justice was equal. It means order had procedures. That distinction matters. A procedure can protect you. It can also exhaust you until you accept the powerful person's version of reality. Still, the presence of legal agency is important, especially for women. Egyptian women, in many periods and contexts, could own property, inherit, make contracts, initiate divorce, and appear before legal authorities. The evidence is not a doorway into modern equality, and it does not erase patriarchy, domestic pressure, maternal expectations, economic dependency, or class difference. But it does complicate the lazy picture of ancient women as universally invisible. In Egypt, a woman could be wife, mother, worker, mourner, manager, priestess, musician, property holder, litigant, and memory keeper. The household was where these formal and informal powers met. Marriage was not only romance, and for many people it may not have required a single state ceremony in the way modern paperwork trains us to expect. Households formed around partnership, property, children, labour, inheritance, and reputation. Love may have existed, tenderness certainly did, but affection had to live beside grain storage, fertility expectations, family pressure, and the practical matter of who owned what when the relationship failed. Religion folded into these domestic layers. People did not only meet the gods in grand temples, they met divine presence through household practices, protective images, amulets, festivals, names, dreams, birth, illness, and death. The official cult of a great god might be managed by priests behind temple walls, but fear and hope were not restricted to priests. A mother worried over a child's fever did not need a royal theology lecture. She needed protection. A worker facing danger did not need an abstract essay on cosmic order. He needed the world to be less likely to break him today. The more closely we look, the less Egypt resembles a single golden machine. It becomes a society of unequal access to the same cosmic story. The king upheld Ma'at with temples and monuments. Officials upheld it with seals and commands. Scribes upheld it with ink. Priests upheld it with ritual. Farmers upheld it with food. Women upheld it with household continuity, property, textiles, children, mourning, offerings, and management that official inscriptions often treated as background, because background labour is where civilizations hide their dependents. Everyone was inside the order. Not everyone benefited equally from it. That is the quiet tension beneath Egypt's greatness. Order can protect. It can make harvests predictable, disputes legible, rituals meaningful, and memory durable. But order can also rank suffering. It can tell one person that his work maintains the universe, and another person that her exhaustion is simply the natural shape of the world. It can turn obedience into virtue, and inequality into scenery. By the time a field is measured, a marriage arranged, a complaint recorded, a ration issued, or a name carved for the dead, the same pattern has appeared again. Egypt takes the fragile things of life and gives them structure. Sometimes the structure shelters. Sometimes it presses down. Often it does both at once. If order holds, the world continues. The difficult question is who has to carry it. The carrying did not always look like carrying. Sometimes it looked like a man bending under a basket. Sometimes it looked like a woman turning grain into food. Sometimes it looked like a priest making an offering in a room most people would never enter. And sometimes, more quietly, it looked like a line of ink drying on a scrap of papyrus, or a pottery shard, turning a living problem into a permanent fact. That may be the hidden mechanism behind so much of Egypt's endurance. The civilization learned how to convert unstable things into stable forms. Floodwater became measured fields, harvest became stored grain, labour became lists, memory became names, religious fear became ritual schedules, death became procedure, a king's body became architecture. Even time, that most slippery thing, was brought under supervision as far as human beings could manage. The Egyptians did not invent bureaucracy in the modern comic sense of fluorescent lights, dead printers, and someone named Dennis saying the form is missing a signature, but they understood something older and deeper. Power becomes durable when it can record. A command spoken aloud disappears into the air. A command written down can travel. It can be copied, checked, stored, brought out later, and used against someone who had been hoping everyone forgot. Ink is very calm when it ruins your day. For the ancient Egyptian state, measurement was not a small technical detail. It was a way of making the world governable. Fields had to be assessed, produce had to be counted, workers had to be allocated, supplies had to be issued, temples had to receive offerings, tomb projects had to be provisioned, expeditions had to be organised, soldiers had to be fed, stone had to be moved from one place to another without everyone simply wandering off into the heat and reconsidering their life choices. None of this happens by vibes. It happens through people who know where things are, who owes what, who has already received rations, which boat is carrying which load, whose crew is assigned to which task, and which official will be blamed if the numbers become embarrassing. This is why the scribe's world matters so much. The scribe did not merely record civilization after the fact. He helped civilization happen. His palette and reed pen were tools of transformation. A basket of grain is food. A recorded basket of grain is food with consequences. A labourer is a person. A listed labourer is a person inside a system. A field is mud and crop. A measured field is revenue waiting to be claimed. The strangeness is that this practical machinery lived beside, and often inside, sacred imagination. Egyptian temples were not just beautiful religious spaces where priests performed timeless rituals while everyone else floated around in spiritual awe. Temples were also economic institutions. They owned land, received goods, employed people, stored wealth, supported workshops, and played a major role in the redistribution of resources. A god might be invisible, but his estate could be very visible indeed. The temple was one of the places where the cosmic and the practical shook hands. Offerings to the gods had to be produced by somebody. Bread, beer, meat, incense, linen, flowers, oil, and other goods did not descend from heaven in neat ceremonial piles. They came from fields, herds, workshops, storehouses, and labour. Ritual required logistics. Holiness had a supply chain. Behind the serene image of divine order stood bakers, brewers, herdsmen, scribes, cleaners, porters, craftsmen, and administrators, making sure the god's household did not run out of things. There is a gentle absurdity here, but also a profound seriousness. The gods were not treated as decorative ideas. They had houses, they had schedules, they had clothing, food, processions, festivals, and estates. Their statues could be washed, dressed, fed, hidden, revealed, moved, praised, and consulted. The daily cult in major temples was carefully managed, often away from the general public. Most people did not casually stroll into the deepest sacred spaces. Divine intimacy was structured by rank, purity, office, and access. In other words, even the gods had bureaucracy around them. But this did not make religion fake, any more than a modern hospital becomes fake because it has billing offices and supply closets. Institutions always need material support. Belief becomes durable when it is given buildings, workers, calendars, storage rooms, titles, and rules. Egypt's religious world lasted so long partly because it was not only believed, it was administered. And this administration touched death with particular intensity. Death in ancient Egypt was not simply the end of life. It was a dangerous transition that required knowledge, preparation, protection, and resources. The best-known forms of mummification and elaborate burial belonged mainly to those who could afford them, and practices changed over time. We have to say that carefully. Not every Egyptian received the treatment of a pharaoh. Not every body was wrapped with expensive precision. Not every tomb was painted for eternity. Poverty followed people toward the grave, as it has in nearly every human society. But the ideal mattered even when reality fell short. The body mattered, the name mattered, offerings mattered, spells, prayers, images, amulets, coffins, tomb placement, and memory could all become part of the struggle to continue beyond death. The afterlife was not imagined as a vague, misty comfort. It had geography, judgment, danger, nourishment, identity, and paperwork of its own. Even eternity, in Egypt, did not appear entirely free from administration. This may be one reason the civilization feels so haunting. Egypt looked at the most uncontrollable facts of human existence, flood and hunger and death, and answered them with systems. It did not remove fear, it gave fear a ritual shape. It did not defeat decay for everyone. It developed techniques and beliefs that made decay negotiable, at least for those with means. It did not make kings immortal in the literal bodily sense. It made their names, images, tombs, and cults difficult to erase. A modern person may see this and think, how strange, to prepare so much for death. But that reaction says more about modern habits than ancient ones. We also organise ourselves around death. We just do it with hospitals, insurance, wills, cemeteries, photographs, passwords, family arguments, and boxes of documents nobody wants to sort through. The Egyptians were more visually honest about it. They built their anxiety in stone and painted it in bright colours. What made Egypt extraordinary was not that it loved death more than other cultures. It was that death became part of the same ordering impulse that governed fields, temples, kingship, and memory. The dead were not abandoned outside the system. They were pulled into it. They had needs, names, dangers, hopes, and in the case of the wealthy, entire architectural arrangements devoted to keeping them socially alive. So the hidden rule becomes clearer. Egypt's greatness rested on conversion. The unstable was made countable. The countable was made manageable. The manageable was made sacred. And the sacred was made permanent, or at least as permanent as mud brick, ink, linen, stone, and human devotion could make it. That does not mean Egypt was frozen. It changed constantly across centuries. Kings rose and fell, capitals shifted, gods gained and lost prominence. Foreign powers arrived, local elites challenged the centre, workers complained, floods failed, tombs were robbed, temples accumulated wealth and influence. The system bent, broke, recovered, and changed its clothing. But the deep habit remained. When life threatened to dissolve into uncertainty, Egypt reached for form. A measured field, a sealed jar, a written name, a wrapped body, a temple door closing softly in the morning. The world could still break, but first someone would try to put it in order. And once a society learns to put the world in order, the order begins to ask for more. That is one of the oldest problems with successful systems. At first, they solve a fear. Then they become a habit. Then they become an expectation. Then, if no one is careful, they become a mouth. Egypt's great structures of kingship, temple wealth, administration, labour, and death did not merely preserve life along the Nile, they also developed appetites of their own. A field could feed a family, but a field could also feed a granary, a temple estate, a labour crew, a festival, a priesthood, a royal project, a military expedition, and a tomb cult for someone who had been dead long enough to be causing logistical inconvenience from beyond the grave. The living were surrounded by the needs of the more powerful living, the gods, and the socially important dead. It is hard enough to pay rent to a landlord. Imagine your obligations also include eternity. This is not a reason to sneer at Egyptian religion. People in the past were not foolish for taking death seriously, or for imagining the divine as active in daily life. Their world was dangerous, and belief gave shape to fear, gratitude, grief, and hope. But systems can be sincere and demanding at the same time. A temple can be holy and wealthy. A tomb can be beautiful and expensive. A king can embody order and still require thousands of human beings to make his order visible. The more Egypt developed its ability to organize, the more organization itself became a form of pressure. Consider the royal building project. To us, from far away, it becomes an achievement. To the state, it was a demonstration. To officials, it was administration. To skilled workers, it might be craft, pride, danger, ration, obligation, and career. To temporary labourers, it might be a season away from ordinary fields, a duty owed, a strain on the household, or a chance at state provisions. To a village left with fewer hands, it may have felt like absence. A monument never stands alone. It casts labour backward through time. Before the stone is admired, someone cuts it. Before it is placed, someone hauls it. Before it is hauled, someone feeds the hauler. Before the food arrives, someone grows grain, brews beer, bakes bread, seals jars, tracks deliveries, repairs tools, drives animals, argues with foremen, counts rope, and tries to keep people alive in a place where the sun does not care about royal ambition. The monument is the visible peak. Beneath it lies a buried mountain of ordinary coordination. This is why the old slave myth is not only inaccurate in its simplest form, it also makes the story smaller. If all we imagine is a whip and a block, we miss the more unsettling reality of a state sophisticated enough to mobilize people, feed them, house them, classify them, inspire them, command them, and absorb their labor into a sacred national project. Brutality can build things, but only organization can keep building them. And organization has consequences. When officials could count grain, shortages became more politically visible. When fields were measured, disputes became matters of record. When temples accumulated land and goods, religious institutions could become major economic powers. When tombs were filled with valuable objects, robbery became both temptation and profession. When kings promised cosmic order, failure became harder to explain. A low flood was not only bad weather, it was a crisis of meaning. This is the difficulty with divine kingship. If the king is connected to order, then order's failures gather near the throne. Drought, famine, military defeat, internal unrest, corruption, local ambition, and administrative weakness could all threaten the image that the world was properly arranged. Of course, no king could command the Nile like a servant. But ideology often asks rulers to stand beside forces no human being can control, and then look confident. The Egyptian state could be extraordinarily resilient, but it was not immune to strain. Periods of central power were interrupted by times of fragmentation, often called intermediate periods by modern historians. These labels can make collapse sound tidy, as if history neatly placed itself between folders. For people living through political breakdown, it would have felt less like an intermediate period, and more like uncertainty entering the room. Local rulers might gain power. Old certainties might weaken. Trade could suffer. Violence might rise. The centre might no longer feel like the centre. Yet Egypt repeatedly rebuilt itself. That may be more impressive than uninterrupted stability. A brittle civilization can look strong until it cracks once. Egypt cracked, reformed, borrowed, adapted, and continued. Its strength was not perfect stillness. It was the ability to restore order after disorder had shown everyone where the seams were. Still, restoration had a cost. Every return to order required work from bodies, loyalty from local elites, legitimacy from religion, resources from land, and memory from scribes. The system had to be refreshed like a ritual. It was not enough to say ma'at. Someone had to enact it. Someone had to dredge, count, carry, sing, swear, carve, obey, dispute, repair, mourn, and begin again. Temples reveal this pressure beautifully. A temple was a point of contact between humans and gods, but it was also a workplace, storehouse, landowner, employer, and theatre of rank. To approach a great temple was to see sacred order made architectural. Massive walls, gateways, columns, courts, dark inner rooms controlled access. The building itself taught a lesson. Holiness has depth, and not everyone may enter equally. The farther inward one went, the more restricted the space became. Public festival might bring divine images into wider view, but the daily intimacy of the god was managed by priests and ritual specialists. Ordinary people could participate in religious life, offer prayers, join festivals, seek protection, and feel devotion, but the deepest rooms belonged to hierarchy. Even divine closeness had a doorway policy. This is not unusual. Societies often place what they value most behind thresholds. But in Egypt, those thresholds multiplied. Between farmer and official, worker and scribe, courtyard and sanctuary, living and dead, king and subject, cultivated land and desert, name remembered and name lost. Order was made through boundaries. Cross the wrong one, and the world could become dangerous. The tomb was another boundary machine. It separated the dead from decay, or tried to. It separated the elite dead from the forgotten dead, or tried to. It separated the name that would endure from the life that had ended. The tomb's walls could show an ideal world where food arrived forever, servants worked forever, fields produced forever, and the dead enjoyed a perfected version of status. A tomb could turn inequality into eternity with paint. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths about Egypt's beauty. Much of what survives most brilliantly comes from people powerful enough to demand survival from material culture. Their names remain because they could afford to make memory durable. Others lived just as fully, loved just as intensely, feared death just as much, and vanished with fewer traces. The civilization's record is magnificent, but it is not democratic. Stone has a class bias. And yet, even with that bias, ordinary people keep appearing at the edges. A worker's mark, a broken tool, a village plan, a letter, a complaint, a worn tooth, a child's burial, a loaf of bread hardened by time. These traces do not shout like kings. They tap softly on the wall of history, reminding us that greatness was never made only by the people whose names were carved largest. The system promised eternity. The human cost was that most people supplied it without receiving much of it. And still, they were not merely victims of a machine. They believed, negotiated, resisted, adapted, joked, prayed, stole, loved, complained, took pride, made beautiful things, raised children, and buried their dead with whatever dignity they could manage. No civilization lasts for centuries if ordinary people only suffer inside it. They must also find meaning, habit, advantage, belonging, and small pleasures within its rules. That is what makes Egypt feel so real after the gold fades. It was not a fantasy of perfect order. It was a long argument with chaos, conducted through mud, ink, stone, bread, ritual, and human endurance. And the argument was about to become even larger, because once Egypt had learned to organize the river valley, it began to look beyond it. Beyond the narrow green world, the map became less obedient. The Nile had taught Egypt to think in lines: river line, field line, boundary line, procession line, lineage line, list after list after list. But outside the valley, the earth did not always cooperate with Egyptian habits. There were deserts with roots rather than fields, seas with winds rather than flood rhythms, southern lands with gold and cattle and people who did not exist merely to make Egyptian inscriptions feel triumphant, eastern roads leading toward the Levant, and neighbours who had their own ambitions, gods, rulers, weapons, and ledgers of grievance. Egypt did not live alone. No civilization does, no matter how much its monuments imply self-sufficiency. The Nile Valley gave Egypt a powerful centre, but that centre depended on exchange with the wider world. Cedar, metals, incense, luxury goods, precious stones, timber, horses in later periods, military technologies, captives, ideas, and diplomatic relationships all moved across borders. Some came by trade, some came by tribute, some came through conquest. Some came through the polite ancient theatre of gift-giving, where powerful rulers sent beautiful objects to one another, while pretending no one was calculating status in the background. A river civilization can become very confident at home and still discover that the wider world requires different manners. This wider Egypt becomes especially visible in the New Kingdom, when Egyptian power stretched into Nubia to the south and into parts of the Levant to the northeast. The old image of Egypt as a still, inward-looking civilization begins to loosen here. Egypt was not only building tombs and contemplating eternity beside the river, it was sending armies, building forts, negotiating with foreign courts, extracting resources, taking captives, absorbing influences, and presenting all of this on temple walls as the restoration of order. Order, once again, is the key word. Egyptian royal ideology often framed foreign enemies as chaos. This was not just propaganda in the cheap sense, though it certainly served propaganda's oldest function, making violence look morally tidy. It was also a way of placing foreign policy inside the same cosmic pattern that governed the fields. The king smites enemies not merely because kings enjoy dramatic poses, although temple art suggests they did not hate them. He does it because he has shown defeating disorder. The border becomes a cosmic edge. War becomes a ritual image. Victory becomes another way to say the world is still arranged correctly. Of course, the people on the other side of that image had their own names for what was happening. This is where we have to be careful with Egyptian sources. Royal inscriptions are magnificent, but they are not neutral witnesses. Kings did not carve temple walls to confess logistical confusion, embarrassing losses, poor morale, supply problems, or the private terror of soldiers far from home. Official art prefers the king large, the enemy small, the gods approving, and the outcome already decided. If ancient battle reliefs had sound, they would probably play trumpets over the part where everyone is hungry and no one knows where the spare sandals went. The reality of military life was surely less polished. Soldiers marched, waited, carried equipment, guarded borders, endured heat, disease, boredom, fear, and commanders with plans that looked better in the palace. Chariots, bows, spears, shields, leather, bronze, horses, dust, sweat, shouted orders, and the confusion of distance all belonged to Egypt's outward face. Empire was not an abstract expansion of colour on a map. It was feet on roads, grain for garrisons, letters sent between anxious officials, forts built in strategic places, and local populations learning what Egyptian order felt like when it arrived armed. The southern story, especially in Nubia, reveals both dependence and domination. Nubia was not just a vague south below Egypt. It had its own cultures, resources, histories, and power. Egypt's relationship with Nubia changed across time, including trade, military campaigns, colonization, administration, interconnection, and later periods when rulers from Kush would themselves control Egypt. Gold from Nubian regions mattered greatly to Egyptian wealth and royal display. But to describe this only as Egypt acquiring resources would flatten the human reality. Extraction means people. Forts mean people. Labour means people. Cultural exchange means people living close enough for influence, resentment, imitation, marriage, service, and memory to cross the lines officials drew. To the northeast, Egypt's involvement in the Levant pulled it into a world of city-states, rival empires, diplomacy, vassal relationships, trade routes, and military pressure. Letters between rulers in the Late Bronze Age show an international system where kings addressed each other with elaborate courtesy while quietly bargaining for gold, brides, loyalty, and advantage. The ancient world could be very formal while being extremely petty, which is one of the reasons it remains recognizable. A king might call another ruler brother, while also implying, with great dignity, that the last shipment was disappointing. Diplomacy did not make Egypt less Egyptian. It reveals how Egyptian power adapted when the river ledger met other ledgers. At home, fields could be measured and taxed through established rhythms. Abroad, influence had to be maintained through garrisons, alliances, gifts, threats, marriages, letters, and the careful management of prestige. Prestige was not decoration, it was political currency. If Egypt looked strong, allies stayed attentive. If Egypt looked weak, distant loyalty became creative. And yet, even at its most imperial, Egypt still translated the outside world into its own symbolic language. Foreign goods could become temple offerings. Captives could become labour. Victories could become war scenes. Tribute could become proof of divine favour. Exotic animals, plants, metals, and luxury items could be arranged into a royal image of abundance. The world beyond Egypt was dangerous, but also useful. It could be conquered, traded with, represented, absorbed, and placed beneath the king's cosmic performance. That performance had real beauty. It also had real violence behind it. A calm history cannot ignore that. Ancient Egypt's greatness included artistic refinement, religious imagination, engineering, medicine, literature, administration, and political endurance. It also included forced labour, conquest, inequality, punishment, and the ordinary cruelties by which ancient states turned human beings into resources. The point is not to cancel awe. The point is to make awe honest. A civilization does not become less impressive when we see the cost. It becomes less childish in our imagination, and perhaps more moving. Because the farther Egypt reached, the more obvious its central paradox became. It wanted order in a world that would not stay ordered. The Nile could fail, officials could steal, workers could complain, tombs could be robbed, foreign rulers could rebel, soldiers could die, dynasties could weaken, temples could grow powerful enough to complicate the crown. The same system that made Egypt durable also made it heavy. Its rituals required performance, its borders required defense. Its gods required offerings, its dead required memory, its living required food. Still, for century after century, Egypt kept answering instability with form. A fort in Nubia, a letter to a foreign court, a temple relief of victory, a list of tribute, a warehouse of grain, a road through the desert, a royal name carved where wind would spend centuries trying to erase it. The civilization widened, but it did not leave the river behind. Even empire remained, in spirit, a kind of irrigation project. Egypt tried to channel the unruly world into roots, tribute, images, titles, and rituals. It tried to make foreignness flow toward the centre. And for a while, astonishingly, much of it did. And yet the centre was never as still as the stone suggested. That is the deeper contradiction of Egypt. Its art often gives us a world without tremor. Kings stride forever. Gods sit in perfect profile. Offerings arrive in clean rows. Enemies fall in symbolic clusters. The dead receive abundance without flies, arguments, or storage problems. Everything appears arranged, polished, disciplined, and calm, as if the civilization had discovered a way to make life stop misbehaving. But life kept misbehaving. The Nile did not always rise as hoped. Officials did not always behave as inscriptions wished. Local power did not always remain politely local. Workers were not tools with sandals. Priests were not decorative servants of royal ideology. Foreign relationships did not stay fixed. Tombs meant to preserve memory attracted thieves. A system designed to defeat disorder kept producing new kinds of disorder because systems, once built, become places where ambition can live. That may be the most human thing about ancient Egypt. It tried to make order permanent, and in doing so, it created institutions strong enough to challenge one another. The king needed temples. Temples needed royal support. Gods needed offerings. Offerings needed land, labour, herds, workshops, and administrators. Over time, major temples could accumulate great wealth and influence. This was not necessarily corruption in the simple sense. It was a natural result of taking religion seriously at scale. If a god has a house, the house needs staff. If the staff performs rituals, they need supplies. If supplies must be regular, land and income must be assigned. If land and income are assigned for long enough, the god's household becomes an economic power. Holiness grows storehouses. That is a wonderful sentence if you are a temple administrator, and a troubling one if you are a king trying to keep every important institution pointed toward the throne. The temple could support royal legitimacy, but it could also gather its own momentum. Priests, estates, archives, workshops, and ritual authority made temples more than religious backdrops. They were centers of wealth, employment, memory, and local influence. The sacred world had accounting departments, and accounting departments rarely remain spiritually weightless. This does not mean Egypt was secretly run by priests at all times, or that every temple was a rival state. That would be too clean. The balance changed across periods, reigns, regions, and cults, but the pattern matters. The same logic that made Egypt durable also made it complicated. To maintain order, the king had to empower institutions. Once empowered, institutions had interests. A permanent system is never only loyal, it is hungry to continue. The tomb economy had a similar tension. Preparing for eternity required labour in the present. Tomb builders, painters, sculptors, quarrymen, embalmers, coffin makers, linen producers, priests, offering bearers, and administrators all participated in a culture where death created work. Again, this was not fake belief. The care of the dead could be sincere, intimate, and emotionally powerful. But sincerity does not cancel economics. The afterlife had industries attached, and those industries were vulnerable to the same pressures as any other. Supplies could run short, payment could be delayed, workers could protest. The famous records from Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who worked on royal tombs in the New Kingdom, include evidence of work stoppages when rations were not delivered properly. That detail is almost too perfect. The people building eternity could still go on strike because dinner was late. It is funny only because it is so human, and it cuts through every fantasy of ancient obedience. These workers were not modern labour activists in the way a modern union organiser would recognise, and we should not force present-day categories onto them too neatly. But they were skilled people who knew their value, depended on state provisions, and could respond when the system failed them. The eternal project still needed bread on schedule. There it is again. Bread under the monument. The stomach under theology. This is the contradiction that keeps returning. Egypt imagined order as cosmic, but it had to maintain that order through perishable things: grain, beer, linen, wood, rope, bodies, animals, cooperation, weather, trust, fear, and time. Stone survived, so we mistake stone for the civilization. But stone was the least hungry part. It did not need wages, it did not need sandals, it did not fall ill, it did not resent an overseer. It did not wonder whether the official in charge had stolen the barley. Human beings did. Even writing, that great stabilizer, could create instability. A record could preserve truth, but also power. It could defend a claim or trap a person inside one. It could expose theft or become part of theft. Lists are not morally pure. They serve whoever controls the counting. A tally can protect a worker's ration, but it can also prove what the worker owes. A land record can settle a boundary, but it can also make dispossession look orderly. Bureaucracy is a knife with a very neat handle. Egypt's genius was to make life legible. Its danger was that legibility could become control. The ordinary person may not have described it that way. They would have felt it as expectation. Bring this, owe that, attend here, work now, pay later, wait outside, come when called, give the offering, respect the boundary, honour the dead, praise the king, trust the gods. The rules were not always written for everyone to read, but they were felt in the muscles. And yet, this same order also gave people tools. Records could support property claims, legal procedures could be used in disputes, religious festivals could create communal joy, temple economies could employ workers, state stores could feed labour crews, skilled positions could give status. Household property could offer women leverage in ways that surprise modern assumptions. A system that presses down may also provide handles. People learn where the handles are. That is why the story cannot be reduced to oppression or glory. Egypt was both more beautiful and more uncomfortable than either simplification allows. It gave the world extraordinary art and architecture. It also depended on unequal labour. It created a religious language of profound endurance. It also turned that endurance into obligations. It preserved names. It forgot countless names. It organised survival. It organised extraction. It honoured the dead. It asked the living to pay for the honour. The deeper contradiction is not hypocrisy, it is civilization. Civilization is what happens when human beings make arrangements strong enough to outlive individuals. That strength can shelter memory, build irrigation, support craft, coordinate food, and create beauty on a scale no household could manage alone. But the same strength can also harden inequality, disguise exploitation as duty, and ask ordinary people to serve abstractions so grand that refusal feels like rebellion against the sky. Ancient Egypt understood this better than most. Its symbols were not small because its problem was not small. How do you keep a narrow green world alive between desert and uncertainty? How do you turn seasonal abundance into durable power? How do you make kings die without making kingship die? How do you persuade the living to labour for the dead? How do you make memory stronger than decay? The answers were magnificent. They were also expensive. By now, the golden mask has changed shape. It no longer looks like a simple treasure. It looks like the polished face of a whole system that has learned to hide mud beneath gold, hunger beneath ritual, labour beneath eternity, and human fragility beneath the calm expression of a king who will never blink again. The mask survives because the face did not. And all along the river, generation after generation, Egypt kept trying to solve that unbearable fact. The unbearable fact was not only that bodies died, it was that bodies kept making demands before they died. They got hungry, they developed fevers, they broke teeth, they suffered infections, parasites, injuries, difficult births, bad joints, failing eyesight, and the thousand small betrayals by which the body reminds every civilization that stone is cheating. Stone gets to seem eternal because it never had to digest bread. Ancient Egypt's medical world grew from this stubborn reality. It was not one thing. It mixed practical observation, inherited remedies, ritual protection, divine appeal, household treatment, specialist knowledge, and theories that made sense inside their own worldview, even when they were wrong about the body. Some Egyptian medical papyri show surprisingly careful attention to wounds, symptoms, treatments, and prognosis. Other remedies involved magic, spells, substances, and symbolic logic that modern medicine would not accept. The ancient healer did not live in our categories. He lived in a world where the body, gods, demons, environment, and hidden forces could all be part of the same problem. That can sound strange until we remember that fear rarely waits for science to become accurate. A mother with a sick child does not want a neat philosophical separation between medicine and prayer. She wants the child to live. A worker with an infected cut does not care whether relief comes from technique, herb, god, charm, or luck. He wants the pain to stop before the hand becomes useless. So Egypt treated illness with the tools it had. Observation where observation helped, ritual where ritual comforted, experience where experience accumulated, and confidence where confidence sometimes exceeded knowledge. This is not a reason to laugh at them. Every age has its confident mistakes. Ours simply come with better packaging and longer disclaimers. The body was also a worker, and that made injury political. A labouring body could be taxed, assigned, counted, punished, fed, healed, replaced, or buried. The state needed bodies, but bodies were fragile. Skeletons, settlement remains, tools, and records all remind us that the people behind Egypt's monuments were not symbols. They had spines, knees, shoulders, hands, lungs, teeth. The cost of civilization was paid through anatomy. Even the dead body, supposedly beyond labour, entered another kind of work. Mummification, at least in its more elaborate forms, was an attempt to preserve identity by preserving form. But the preserved body was not merely a medical object. It was religious, social, economic, and emotional. The wealthy could buy more elaborate protection. The poor did what they could. Somewhere between those extremes lived a wide range of practices, changing across time, shaped by money, local custom, family devotion, and access to specialists. The modern museum can make mummies feel silent and strange, but in their own world they were not curiosities. They were relatives, kings, officials, priests, children, women, men, people who had crossed the most dangerous border. The body mattered because personhood mattered. The name mattered because memory mattered. The tomb mattered because the dead still had a place in society. But tombs created a problem so obvious that even reverence could not solve it. If you put valuable things with dead people, living people may eventually notice. Tomb robbery is one of the great pressure points in Egyptian history. It exposes the gap between ideal and reality with almost rude clarity. The ideal said that tomb goods helped sustain and protect the dead. The ideal said that a sealed burial space guarded memory and status. The ideal said that eternity could be provisioned. But the reality was that gold, copper, linen, oils, wood, jewellery, tools, and other goods had value among the living. A tomb was sacred. It was also, to desperate or organised thieves, a locked storeroom with a corpse in it. This is where Egyptian eternity becomes painfully practical. Royal tombs were hidden, sealed, guarded, cursed in spirit if not always in the movie poster sense, and still robbed. Officials investigated. Confessions and trials appear in records from certain periods. Some tomb robbers may have been outsiders, some insiders, some workers familiar with the landscape of burial, some people acting from poverty, greed, opportunity, or networks of corruption. The details vary, but the larger meaning is clear. A society can build for forever and still lose a door to someone with enough motive and knowledge. There is something almost darkly funny about the amount of effort Egypt spent trying to secure the afterlife, only for the afterlife to develop a burglary problem. But the joke should be aimed at the impossible ambition, not the dead. The human wish underneath it is tender. People wanted continuity. They wanted their names to be spoken, their bodies protected, their loved ones provided for, their status remembered, their disappearance made less absolute. Tomb robbery violated more than property. It attacked memory. And memory was one of Egypt's great currencies. To erase a name was dangerous in a culture where being remembered mattered. To damage an image could be more than vandalism. To reuse stone, alter inscriptions, or appropriate monuments was not only practical recycling, though practicality was often involved. It could also be political memory management. Later kings could claim, revise, overwrite, or diminish earlier ones. Even eternity had editing. The past was not safe in Egypt. It had to be defended. This pressure appears in royal history as well. Kings wanted to be remembered in certain ways. Official inscriptions often present triumph, piety, building, restoration, and control. They do not usually dwell on doubt, failure, debt, disease, factional tension, or the boring chaos that makes government real. A king's public image was an organized surface. Behind it stood courtiers, priests, generals, scribes, family politics, succession problems, and the constant risk that a future ruler would decide your memory needed improvement with a chisel. The hidden cost of Egyptian order, then, was maintenance. Everything had to be maintained. Canals, fields, borders, temples, statues, cults, records, tombs, names, stories, bodies, legitimacy. A cracked wall, a missed ration, a failed flood, a robbed tomb, a weak heir, a greedy official, a rebellious province, a sick labour crew. Each one was a small vote for chaos. And chaos did not need to win all at once. It only needed to make order tired. This is why the civilization's durability should not be imagined as ease. Lasting a long time is not the same as being stable every morning. Egypt endured because people repeatedly repaired the arrangement. The field was damaged, it was restored. The record was disputed, it was checked. The tomb was threatened, it was sealed again. The god required offerings, someone delivered them. The king died, kingship continued. The body failed, ritual tried to carry identity across. What looked like permanence was often repetition performed with astonishing stubbornness. The red desert kept the bones of the past. The black land kept demanding the labour of the present. Between them, Egypt built one of the most powerful answers ever given to human vulnerability. Measure it, name it, wrap it, feed it, carve it, pray over it, and place it within order. But even the best order could not make the body invincible, and that truth, more than any curse, is what makes Egypt's surviving faces so haunting. They do not look at us from beyond death because Egypt defeated death. They look at us because Egypt refused to let death have the last word without a fight. The fight against death was never fought by kings alone. It is tempting, when looking at ancient Egypt, to imagine history as a procession of famous names: Khufu, Hatshepsut, Thutmose, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses. The names are useful, they give us handles, but handles are not the door. Behind each royal name stood thousands of people whose own names were spoken in kitchens, workshops, fields, boats, barracks, nurseries, and burial places, then vanished from the record or survived only by accident. Egypt was a civilization of names, yet most of its people remain unnamed to us. That is not because their lives were empty. It is because preservation has preferences. Stone prefers kings. Tomb walls prefer elites. Archives prefer transactions. Archaeology, when it is lucky, gives us pottery, footprints, tools, bones, trash, and broken things that nobody thought majestic enough to protect. Ordinary people do not disappear because they mattered less to themselves. They disappear because time is a terrible archivist, unless wealth, dryness, luck, or bureaucracy intervene. So the human cost of Egypt must be reconstructed carefully, not as a single tragedy, but as a wide field of unequal lives. A skilled tomb artisan at Deir el-Medina did not live the same life as a seasonal field labourer. A temple singer did not live the same life as a captive brought from war. A woman with property and family backing did not face the same risks as a poor widow with few protections. A child born into an official household met the state differently from a child born into a household whose grain was always close to running out. Still, all of them lived under the same enormous fact. The system needed human continuation. It needed children to grow into workers, daughters to manage households, sons to inherit obligations, families to remember the dead, specialists to learn trades, priests to repeat rituals, scribes to copy records, soldiers to guard borders, farmers to coax food from wet earth, and mourners to keep the names from sinking. A civilization this old is not built once. It is inherited by the tired. Imagine a boy born near the river, not into misery necessarily, but into expectation. He learns early that water is not just water, it decides the year. He learns which adults have authority and which ones only sound like they do. He learns that grain has a path upward. He learns that writing can make adults anxious. He learns that the gods are present, but access to them is managed by people with titles. He learns that the dead are not gone in the way a broken pot is gone. They remain as duties, names, images and places one must respect. If he is fortunate, talented, connected, or placed in the right family, he might learn letters. That changes the shape of his future. Scribal training was demanding, but it offered a route away from the most punishing kinds of manual labour. The promise was simple enough for any age to understand. Master signs, and perhaps your hands will hold a reed pen instead of a hoe. That promise did not erase hierarchy. It reproduced it with education. If he remains in agricultural labour, his life follows the field more closely. Flood, sowing, harvest, repair. Animals, tools, weather, tax, family. His body becomes a calendar. His back knows seasons better than royal annals do. He may participate in festivals, tell stories, make offerings, worry over children, complain about officials, laugh with neighbours, and take pride in competence. Poverty does not erase personality. Labour does not erase humour. But the margin for failure is narrower. A bad year does not become an interesting policy challenge. It becomes thinner meals. Now imagine a girl in the same world. Her future is not one story either. She may grind grain, help with brewing, weaving, childcare, household production, trade, offerings, mourning, and property concerns. In some circumstances, she may own and dispose of property, make legal arrangements, inherit, or initiate separation. In another context, she may have little practical power, despite what the law theoretically allows. Law is a door, but class, family, age, gender, and local pressure decide how easy it is to open. For many women, the household was not a private retreat from the economy. It was the economy in its most intimate form. Food production, textile work, child survival, storage, exchange, cleaning, care for the sick, religious practice, and memory work all passed through domestic life. The ancient world often makes this labour look natural, which is one of the oldest tricks for making labour invisible. If everyone expects it, no one has to praise it. But Egypt, with all its temples and kings, leaned on this invisible work every morning. The same was true for servants and dependents, though their situations varied widely. Some might be attached to households or institutions in ways that offered food and place, but limited freedom. Captives taken in war could be brought into labour systems far from home. Enslaved people existed in ancient Egypt, though slavery there was not always identical across periods or to later Atlantic systems, and we must avoid careless comparisons that flatten very different histories. What matters here is not a neat label alone, but the reality that some people's lives and labour were controlled by others in deeply unequal ways. Empire made this sharper. Military success did not only produce heroic images on walls, it produced captives, tribute, displacement, forced service, and new layers of dependency. The temple relief may show order restored. The person led away from home may have experienced that order as rupture. Every imperial image has an outside edge where someone else's grief begins. And still, human beings inside such systems do not exist only as suffering. That is another kind of erasure. They adapt, they form relationships, they learn language, they preserve memory in quiet ways. They resist when they can, submit when they must, negotiate when possible, and survive in the small spaces left between commands. The human cost of Egypt includes pain, but also skill, wit, tenderness, stubbornness, and the daily refusal to be only what power calls you. This is especially clear in mourning. Egypt's funerary culture can look elaborate from the outside, but beneath the ritual was a familiar wound. Someone had died. Someone had to carry grief into form. A body had to be prepared. A place had to be chosen. Words had to be spoken. Offerings had to be made. The dead person had to be changed from a frightening absence into a continuing presence that the family could live with. Elite funerals made this process visible in costly ways, but even modest burial has emotional weight. A small grave, a few goods, a wrapped body, a remembered name. These are not failures beside pyramids. They are the same human impulse at a different scale. Everyone cannot build eternity in stone. Many people build it in memory, and memory is fragile enough to be an act of courage. The tragedy is that most of those memories are gone. We can admire the pyramids and still feel the silence around them. We can respect the sophistication of Egyptian order and still ask who paid for it, in sore hands, interrupted sleep, lost children, military service, grain obligations, and lives spent maintaining someone else's permanence. We can be moved by the beauty without pretending beauty was innocent. That is the adult version of awe. Not less wonder, but deeper wonder. Because the true greatness of Egypt is not that it produced monuments untouched by human cost. No civilization has ever done that. Its greatness is that, even through hierarchy, exhaustion, belief, inequality, and loss, it created a world so coherent that fragments still speak. A worn tool speaks. A legal complaint speaks. A worker's village speaks. A painted offering speaks. A broken bowl speaks. A name scratched somewhere it was never meant to become famous speaks. The kings tried to live forever. In a strange way, so did everyone else. Most did not succeed by name, but they remain in the civilization's weight, in the mud brick dust, in the bread ovens, in the tomb corridors, in the measured fields, in the rhythm of a society that kept remaking order because the alternative was too frightening to accept. The famous dead shine brightly. The unnamed dead hold up the light. The light they hold is uneven because the evidence itself is uneven. This matters more than it may seem. Ancient Egypt is one of the most visually familiar civilizations on Earth, yet familiarity can become a trap. We have seen the statues, the masks, the tomb paintings, the pyramids, the hieroglyphs, the museum cases full of linen and amulets, and small carved servants ready to work in the next world. The surface is so rich that it tempts us into thinking we know the whole room. But the room has shadows. History does not come to us as a fair sample. It comes as survival. Stone survives better than wood. Gold survives better than bread. Tombs survive better than laughter. Royal names survive better than nicknames. Dry desert burials survive better than damp village habits. A legal document survives better when the argument that made everyone angry enough to need it. What we call ancient Egypt is partly a civilization and partly the afterlife of its materials. That is why the greatest danger is not knowing too little. It is knowing too confidently from the wrong things. A tomb painting of a feast can show us food, music, clothing, furniture, ideals, gestures, and elite imagination. It cannot tell us that every dinner looked like that. A royal inscription can tell us what a king wanted carved into permanence. It cannot be trusted like a private confession. A mummified body can reveal health, technique, diet, disease, age, amulets, injuries, and care. It cannot speak all the thoughts that passed through that life. Archaeology gives us astonishing intimacy and absolute silence at the same time. This is especially important with mummification. Modern viewers often treat it as the single Egyptian practice, the central obsession, as if every person in the Nile Valley was carefully embalmed and tucked into eternity with museum-grade drama. The truth is much more varied. Practices changed across time. Wealth mattered enormously. Early preservation could happen naturally in dry desert conditions. Artificial mummification developed and changed. And even in periods when elite mummification was important, many people were buried without the elaborate treatment that later became famous. So when we say the Egyptians believed the body mattered, we are speaking about a strong cultural idea, not an identical experience for every person. A king's body, a noble's body, a craft worker's body, a child's body, and a poor farmer's body did not receive the same journey into the earth. Equality is not produced by shared belief. Sometimes shared belief only makes inequality more visible. The same caution applies to the pyramids. They are real, enormous, and still astonishing, which is precisely why myths gather around them like tourists with bad sunscreen. The less satisfying story says they were built by aliens, lost machines, or impossible secrets. The better story is harder and more human. It involves organisation, skilled labour, logistics, food supply, stoneworking, measurement, transport, administration, and the ability of a state to mobilise bodies and belief at scale. That is not less impressive, it is more impressive, because it requires us to admire humans instead of escaping into fantasy. Pseudo-mysteries often grow where real complexity has been made boring. If someone says administration, labour crews, quarrying, ramps, provisioning, and long-term planning, the internet yawns. If someone whispers forbidden technology, the internet sits up and knocks over a lamp. But the actual past does not need fake magic. Ancient Egypt had enough real difficulty. It does not need aliens to become wonderful. It needs patience. Patience also helps with famous individuals. Take Tutankhamun, for example. His tomb became one of the great archaeological discoveries of the modern age because it preserved so much material splendour. But his fame today is partly an accident of survival and discovery, not proof that he was Egypt's most important king. The young king's afterlife became enormous in modern imagination because his burial escaped some of the losses that swallowed so many others. History sometimes remembers people, not because they mattered most in life, but because time failed to finish eating their room. That is not an insult to him. It is a warning to us. Akhenaten offers another kind of warning. His religious changes in the New Kingdom, especially the elevation of the Aten, have often been described in modern language that can become too clean: reformer, heretic, monotheist, revolutionary. Some of those words may point towards something useful, but each can also smuggle in modern expectations. Ancient theology does not always fit into modern boxes. The evidence shows major disruption, artistic change, religious emphasis, political tension, and later rejection. But the inner motives are harder to hold. Was it devotion, control, theology, politics, personality, court strategy, or all of them braided together? The honest answer is that certainty thins as we move inward. Egypt's queens and powerful women require similar care. Hatshepsut was a remarkable ruler who used kingship's visual language in ways that challenge modern assumptions about gender and power. But she was not simply a modern feminist dropped into a temple relief. Cleopatra, much later and outside the main ancient pharaonic periods most people imagine, belonged to a Ptolemaic Greek dynasty ruling Egypt in a Mediterranean political world shaped by Rome. To fold her casually into Pyramid Egypt is like discussing the medieval world and then inviting Napoleon because there are horses. Chronology is not decoration, it is load-bearing. This is one of the hardest things about telling Egypt well. The civilization lasted so long that almost any simple sentence can become false if stretched too far. Egyptians believed. Which Egyptians? In which century? Women could. Which women? Of what class? In what legal setting? Workers were. Which workers? On what project? Under what obligation? Pharaohs ruled. Which dynasty? What political strength? What regional situation? A clean sentence may be pleasant to hear, but history often asks for a wrinkle. And still, the story must not become so cautious that it dissolves. There are strong patterns. The Nile mattered, agriculture mattered, mart mattered, kingship mattered, temples mattered, the afterlife mattered, writing mattered, class mattered, labour mattered, memory mattered. These are not fragile guesses, they are the beams of the house. The caution is about the rooms. The evidence has become richer because modern methods keep changing what can be asked. Archaeologists study settlements, not only tombs. Human remains can be examined with non-invasive imaging and other scientific tools. DNA research, when preservation allows and interpretation is responsible, can add new questions about ancestry, movement, and population history. Residues, textiles, tools, animal bones, botanical remains, quarry marks, ostraca, and worker villages all help pull Egypt down from the temple wall and back into lived space. But every new method must be handled with humility. Science does not magically remove interpretation. A scan can show an amulet beneath wrappings. It cannot tell us exactly what the person's mother whispered at burial. A skeleton can show stress, age, injury, or disease. It cannot tell us whether the person felt proud, lonely, bored, devout, resentful, or loved. The closer we get to the body, the more we feel the remaining distance. That distance is not failure. It is part of the truth. The mythic Egypt of popular culture wants everything solved. Who built it? What it meant? What secret they knew? What curse protected it? What single genius explains it? The real Egypt is more demanding and more generous. It gives us enough to understand a great deal and withholds enough to keep arrogance away. It asks us to admire without inventing, to wonder without lying, to accept that uncertainty can be more respectful than a beautiful false answer. Because the past is not a puzzle box built for our entertainment. It was someone's present. And if we listen carefully, the fragments do not become smaller when we admit what we do not know. They become more alive. A broken bowl is no longer filler between royal names. It is evidence of a hand. A worker's complaint is not a footnote. It is the sound of a system failing at dinner. A modest burial is not a poor version of a pyramid. It is a family doing what it could against disappearance. The greatest civilization of the ancient world was not greatest because it left us no questions. It was greatest because, after all the questions, the river still runs through the evidence. The river still runs, but memory changes its banks. Ancient Egypt did not end in a single dramatic breath. Civilizations this old rarely exit politely. They are altered, conquered, absorbed, revived, reinterpreted, translated, looted, romanticized, studied, and misunderstood in layers. Egyptian power shifted across centuries. Foreign dynasties ruled. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and later powers entered the story. Religious life changed. Languages changed. Scripts became unreadable to most of the world. Temples fell silent or were repurposed. Statues broke. Tombs opened. Sand moved in. Villagers lived beside ruins that had already become ancient. That is one of the strangest things about Egypt. Even in antiquity, Egypt was old. A person living under the Ptolemies could look back at the pyramids of Giza as monuments from a past more remote to them than the Roman Empire is to us. That fact is useful because it breaks the lazy habit of placing all of Egypt into one golden afternoon. The builders of the Great Pyramid and the court of Cleopatra did not belong to the same immediate world. They were separated by language shifts, political changes, religious developments, artistic transformations, foreign rule, and more than 2,000 years of history. The Nile connected them, but time had done its work. Yet later ages kept reaching for Egypt as if it were a single object. The Greeks admired, argued with, borrowed from and fantasized about Egypt. Romans carried Egyptian obelisks into imperial spaces and absorbed Egyptian gods into Mediterranean religious life. Isis, in particular, travelled far beyond the Nile, becoming part of a wider religious landscape. Egyptian imagery could signal antiquity, wisdom, exotic power, sacred mystery, or imperial possession, depending on who was using it and why. Egypt became not only a place, but a symbol other people could spend. That symbolic spending never really stopped. When ancient scripts were no longer understood, Egyptian monuments became even easier to imagine incorrectly. Hieroglyphs looked meaningful, but their meaning was locked away. To stand before them without being able to read them was to stand before a civilization that seemed to be speaking through a sealed mouth. Mystery rushed in, and where mystery enters, people bring their own furniture. Some brought reverence, some brought scholarship, some brought greed, some brought fantasies, some brought empire. The modern rediscovery and study of Egypt cannot be separated from colonial power, collecting, excavation, tourism, museum culture, and the appetite of wealthy nations for the ancient things of others. That does not mean every early scholar was cynical or every excavation worthless. Many people worked with real curiosity, discipline, and care, but the larger pattern matters. Egypt's ancient dead were often studied, displayed, transported, unwrapped, purchased, and arranged for audiences far from the communities and landscapes that gave them meaning. A mummy in a museum case can teach. It can also testify to a long history of possession. This is uncomfortable, but necessary. Modern Egyptology gave the world extraordinary knowledge. The decipherment of hieroglyphs helped return voice to texts that had been silent to outsiders for centuries. Archaeology revealed settlements, tools, tombs, labour systems, art, religious practice, and daily life. Scientific study has deepened our understanding of diet, disease, craft, burial, trade, and technology. But the modern love of Egypt has often carried two shadows: the desire to know and the desire to own. The second shadow is why the question, "Where does this object belong?" remains alive. A statue, coffin, papyrus, amulet, or relief is never only an educational item floating in neutral space. It has a place of origin, a route of removal, a chain of custody, a legal status, a sacred or funerary context, and a modern political meaning. Even when objects are carefully preserved in museums, their presence can raise difficult questions about history's habit of turning other people's ancestors into collections. The old Egyptian fear was that a name might be lost. The modern irony is that many names survived, while the bodies and objects attached to them travelled farther than their owners could ever have imagined. Popular culture added another layer. Egypt became a stage set for adventure. Curses, tombs, hidden chambers, lost jewels, secret knowledge, sinister priests, glamorous queens, and sand blowing over everything at exactly the right dramatic angle. Some of it is fun. There is nothing wrong with a good story when everyone knows it is a story. The problem begins when entertainment replaces the past so completely that real Egyptians disappear behind props. The curse is a perfect example. The idea of the mummy's curse became famous in modern media, especially after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. It offered a delicious reversal, the dead striking back at the living who disturbed them. It is dramatically satisfying. It is also a modern myth inflated far beyond the evidence. Ancient Egyptians did use protective texts and warnings in some contexts, and tomb violation was taken seriously. But the popular curse narrative owes much to modern journalism, fiction, anxiety, and the thrill of imagining archaeology as trespass punished by supernatural revenge. The actual revenge of the tomb is quieter. It is that, after all our stories, we still have to face the person inside. Not a monster, not a prop, a person. That is the modern echo Egypt keeps sending back. We inherit images and must decide whether to flatten them or listen to them. The pyramid can become an alien landing pad, or it can become evidence of organisation, labour, mathematics, authority, belief, and the dangerous beauty of state power. A mummy can become a horror object, or it can become a preserved human body shaped by grief, religion, craft, and inequality. A queen can become a costume, or she can become a ruler, caught inside the political language available to her. A hieroglyph can become decoration, or it can become a sentence. The difference is attention. Egypt survives partly because it is visually unforgettable. The art has an unusual power. Human figures in profile, gods with animal heads, boats of the sun, blue hair, gold skin, lotus flowers, falcons, jackals, ankhs, scarabs, eyes, crowns, offering tables, stars painted above tomb ceilings. Even when misunderstood, these images grip the mind. They feel orderly, strange, calm, and alive. They seem to say that the world can be arranged if only one knows the proper sign. That may be why Egypt continues to attract both scholarship and fantasy. It offers the pleasure of order and the thrill of mystery at the same time. It gives us measurements and missing pieces. It gives us kings with dates and gods with shifting identities. It gives us preserved bodies and vanished voices. It gives us stone permanence and human uncertainty. For a tired modern world, Egypt is irresistible because it looks like a civilization that believed meaning could be built. But the more carefully we look, the less Egypt belongs to fantasy. It belongs to work, to agricultural timing, to accounting, to religious performance, to women's property disputes, to workmen waiting for rations, to children buried with care, to priests opening temple doors before dawn, to soldiers posted far from the river, to officials trying to make reality match the record, to families speaking names into the dark. That is the legacy worth keeping. Not Egypt as a mystery machine, not Egypt as a treasure room, not Egypt as proof of impossible secrets. Egypt as a long human experiment in making order visible. Egypt as the civilization that took mud, water, grain, fear, death, hierarchy, beauty, and memory, and arranged them so powerfully that even its ruins still feel intentional. The modern world has different tools, but the impulse is familiar. We still measure floods, store food, record names, build monuments, preserve bodies, argue over inheritance, display power through architecture, turn belief into institutions, and hope our records will outlive us. We do not live in ancient Egypt, but we understand the wish underneath it. We also want the world to hold still long enough to mean something. And perhaps that is why Egypt still feels close, even when its world is impossibly far away. The distance is obvious. We do not wake to the same gods. We do not measure fields after the flood with the same tools. We do not think a king's ritual performance keeps the sun obedient. Most of us do not prepare for death by arranging furniture, food, names, images, and spells in a chamber cut for another life. We read the monuments as history, not as active machinery holding the cosmos together. But the shape of the hope is familiar. We still want disorder to become legible. We still want the body to be protected from what it cannot control. We still want food to arrive, names to survive, buildings to stand, children to inherit, rulers to make sense of catastrophe, and records to prove that something happened because otherwise memory feels too soft. We still want the river, whatever river we live beside, to be explainable. Ancient Egypt's deepest legacy is not simply that it built things that lasted. It is that it made lasting itself into a social project. That is different. A stone can last by accident. A desert can preserve what nobody intended to preserve. But Egypt turned endurance into an aim shared across religion, architecture, writing, agriculture, kingship, and domestic life. It taught itself, over and over, to act as if permanence could be made from perishable acts. That is why the smallest gestures matter. A scribe dipping a reed pen, a woman sealing a jar, a worker smoothing plaster in a tomb corridor, a priest lifting bread toward a god, a farmer watching watermarks on the bank, a child learning a name that must not be forgotten. None of these gestures looks like the whole civilization while it is happening, but together they create the rhythm that made the whole civilization possible. The world does not become ordered in one heroic moment. It becomes ordered by repetition. This is easy to miss because monuments are louder than maintenance. A pyramid announces itself. A repaired canal bank does not. A colossal statue demands attention. A clean storage room does not. A painted tomb scene catches the eye. A correctly issued ration disappears into someone's stomach and leaves no glitter behind. But if we ask what truly held Egypt together, we keep returning to acts that are not glamorous enough for postcards. Measuring, storing, assigning, feeding, copying, repairing, burying, remembering. Civilization is often built from verbs that sound boring until they fail. When the grain is not stored, the monument cannot be built. When the ration is not delivered, the skilled worker stops working. When the canal is not maintained, the field suffers. When the scribe's record is wrong or corrupt, trust frays. When the tomb is not protected, memory is violated. When the god is not honoured, fear creeps in through the ritual gap. When the king cannot convincingly stand for order, the crown becomes a hat with pressure underneath. Egypt made these failures meaningful because it imagined order as sacred. This could be beautiful. It could also be oppressive. A sacred system gives dignity to labour, but it can also make refusal feel like sacrilege. It can tell people that their work matters to the universe, and then quietly use that belief to ask for more work. The same story that comforts a community can serve the people who command it. That ambiguity is not a flaw in the script of Egypt, it is the heart of it. The civilization's greatness lives in the tension between shelter and burden. The river gave life, but made people dependent on cycles they could not control. The state organized resources, but turned survival into obligation. Writing preserved memory, but allowed power to travel beyond the speaker. Temples connected humans to gods, but gathered wealth and guarded access. Tombs honored the dead, but displayed inequality with stunning elegance. Kingship promised order, but attached cosmic meaning to political authority. Beauty rose from the system, and so did pressure. To see only beauty is childish. To see only pressure is also too simple. Egypt deserves a harder kind of admiration. Imagine standing at dusk, where the green land thins toward desert. The field is no longer bright. The river moves with that old indifference, carrying reflections it does not bother to keep. Somewhere there is a house where bread is cooling. Somewhere a temple door has closed. Somewhere a scribe has finished a record that will outlive the mood of the day. Somewhere a family is speaking to the dead as if the dead are still within reach. Somewhere a worker is rubbing dust from his eyes. Somewhere a king's name has been carved deeper than the life that bore it. Nothing in that scene is simple. Everything belongs together. This is why the greatest civilization title needs care. Greatest can become a lazy word. It can mean biggest, oldest, richest, most famous, most photographed, most useful for dramatic music. But if Egypt deserves the word, it is not because it was flawless, or because it was more moral than other civilizations, or because it possessed secret knowledge beyond human explanation. It deserves awe because it built one of the ancient world's most enduring systems for turning uncertainty into form. That is the real achievement. The flood was uncertain, so Egypt made calendars, measurements, rituals, and agricultural rhythms. Death was terrifying, so Egypt made tombs, texts, wrappings, offerings, and names. Power was fragile, so Egypt made kingship divine, visible, repetitive, and monumental. Memory was vulnerable, so Egypt carved, painted, copied, sealed, buried, and recited. The human body was temporary, so Egypt surrounded it with systems that insisted the person might continue. And yet every one of these answers remained incomplete. The flood could fail. The dead could be forgotten. The tomb could be robbed. The king could be erased. The body could decay. The text could be broken. The temple could fall silent. The order could crack. Egypt's greatness was not that it solved the human condition. It was that it refused to leave the human condition unarranged. That refusal is what still reaches us. Not just the gold, not just the stone, not just the animal-headed gods or the painted eyes watching from coffin lids. It is the feeling that an entire society looked at the fragility of life and said, "We will measure it, feed it, name it, decorate it, ritualize it, command it, mourn it, and build around it until chaos has to work harder to get in." Chaos always got in eventually. It gets into every civilization. It slips through succession disputes, droughts, corruption, invasion, disease, exhaustion, neglect, and time. But Egypt made chaos fight for every room. That is why the final image cannot be only a pyramid under stars. That image is too clean. It leaves out the mud. The better image is smaller, a scribe at the edge of a field after the flood, reed pen ready, sandals marked by damp earth, watching the land reappear from water. Behind him are farmers, storage jars, animals, children, debts, gods, tombs, kings, and the long machinery of expectation. Before him is the field, still soft, still uncertain. He lowers the pen. The river has moved. Now the world must be written back into order. And that, more than the gold, is Egypt. The pen touches down, and the civilization becomes less distant. Not because we can truly enter it, we cannot. The rooms are gone, the voices thinned, the jokes mostly lost, the songs broken into fragments, the private gestures beyond recovery. No careful historian should pretend otherwise. We stand outside ancient Egypt, looking through what survived. Walls, bones, tools, texts, tombs, statues, pottery, dust, and the stubborn afterlife of names. The distance remains. But distance is not emptiness. Across that distance, we can still recognize the human effort. The effort to make hunger predictable. The effort to make authority believable. The effort to make grief useful. The effort to make death less rude. The effort to give the world a shape strong enough that a child could wake inside it and know, more or less, what the morning required. That may be the quietest definition of civilization, a shared answer to the morning. For ancient Egypt, the morning answer came again and again from the river. Light on water, mud on skin, smoke from ovens, boats moving with goods and messages, birds rising from the reeds, workers lifting tools, priests preparing ritual, scribes uncapping memory, women managing the difficult kingdom of the household, children learning by watching, officials arriving with expectations, the dead waiting in the desert, not exactly gone, not exactly present, held in place by names, offerings, and hope. The beauty of Egypt was that all of this belonged to one imagined order. The danger of Egypt was that all of this belonged to one imagined order. That is the tension we should leave intact. Egypt does not need us to make it innocent in order to admire it. It does not need us to pretend that pyramids were gentle, that hierarchy was harmless, that empire was only splendor, that temples were only prayer, or that tombs were only art. The civilization was greater than those simplifications because it contained contradictions strong enough to last for millennia. It was tender with the dead and demanding of the living. It loved memory and used forgetting as a weapon. It made the body sacred, then ranked bodies by wealth and power. It honoured order, but order sometimes meant obedience. It created beauty from labour and labour from belief. It built for eternity using people who still had sore backs, bad teeth, family worries, and dinner to find. This is not a reason to look away from the monuments. It is a reason to look at them longer. The pyramid changes when we see the village behind it. The tomb painting changes when we hear the grinding stone in the kitchen. The golden mask changes when we remember the face beneath it once belonged to a body that could weaken, sweat, sleep, and die. The hieroglyph changes when it stops being decoration and becomes someone's attempt to make a word outlast a mouth. The temple changes when we understand that holiness had storage rooms. And the Nile changes most of all. At the beginning it seemed like the giver, the miracle, the natural source of Egypt's greatness. It was that partly, but now it looks less like an answer and more like a question asked every year. What will you do with abundance? What will you do with uncertainty? How will you divide the field? Who will count the grain? Who will eat first? Who will serve the god? Who will build the tomb? Who will remember the dead? Who will carry the order when the order grows heavy? Egypt's answer was not one answer. It was a 1,000-year habit of answers. Measure, store, write, build, pray, rule, repair, bury, paint, count, sing, seal, open, close, begin again. That rhythm is why ancient Egypt still feels strangely alive. Not alive in the silly sense that some secret curse breathes in the tomb corridors. Alive because its problems are not dead. We still live with rulers who want legitimacy, institutions that gather wealth, records that protect and control, bodies that fail, families that mourn, workers whose labour becomes someone else's monument, and societies that turn practical arrangements into sacred stories. We are not ancient Egyptians, but we know what it means to build systems against fear. They built theirs from river mud, stone, grain, gold, linen, ink, cattle, incense, sunlight, and human obedience. We build ours from concrete, electricity, databases, medicine, insurance, law, passwords, satellites, hospitals, and archives. The materials changed, the wish did not. We still want our names to remain somewhere safe. We still want our dead to be more than gone. We still want our food supply to behave. We still want power to explain itself. We still want chaos to knock before entering. It never does. Chaos entered Egypt over and over, through low floods and high ambitions, through palace uncertainty and foreign invasion, through corruption, tomb robbery, disease, failed rations, shifting gods, political fracture, and the patient erosion of time. Even the greatest civilization of the ancient world could not make permanence permanent. Its temples fell quiet. Its scripts were forgotten by living readers. Its kings became museum labels. Its bodies crossed seas in crates. Its gods became symbols. Then art, then questions. And still, Egypt did not vanish. It changed form. It became ruins beside villages, stories in foreign books, objects in museums, arguments among scholars, images in films, claims in politics, dreams in travellers' minds, and warnings against every lazy fantasy that mistakes mystery for truth. It became a civilization we keep returning to because it offers both distance and recognition. It is strange enough to humble us and familiar enough to accuse us. Perhaps that is why the old faces seem so calm. Not because the people behind them were calm. They were human. They feared, desired, schemed, worked, loved, lied, prayed, aged, and disappeared. The calm belongs to the image, to the system, to the civilization's long attempt to place a steady mask over the moving face of life. But if we listen beneath the mask, we hear movement. We hear water sliding past the bank. We hear grain poured into a jar. We hear a reed pen scratching. We hear sandals in dust. We hear a door closing inside a temple. We hear a mother calling a child away from the river's edge. We hear workers laughing where official art forgot to paint laughter. We hear a mourner speaking a name because silence felt too close to death. And somewhere in that sound, the true story of Egypt becomes clearer. It was not a civilization that escaped time. It was a civilization that negotiated with time so intensely that time left receipts. Those receipts are everywhere. In stone, in bone, in ink, in broken pottery, in fields measured after flood, in the face of a king who could not stay alive but could stay visible, in the tools of workers who did not become famous but made fame possible, in the tombs that failed to secure eternity and still carried grief across thousands of years. Ancient Egypt was great not because it solved life, death, power, hunger, memory, or fear, It was great because it saw those forces clearly enough to build around them. It turned the river into a calendar, grain into authority, writing into memory, death into architecture, and order into a sacred burden. And after all the gold has dimmed, after the theories have fallen away, after the museum glass reflects our own faces back at us, that is what remains. A field after the flood, a pen above the page, a human being trying to make the world hold still. Egypt's eternity was made one measured harvest at a time.